Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Developers have a need for speed to meet market demands, and application security needs to ensure that data and privacy constraints are met. Unfortunately, that can slow down delivery. So, is it even possible to deliver secure software quickly? Enter Secure Coding, brought to you by GuidePoint Security's Application Security Services. Secure coding is more than a process, it's a cultural shift. One that will make it possible for both developers and Appsec to build in security while applications are being developed. Visit our Appsec resource hub to learn more at securityweekly.com/guidepoint. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. This segment is sponsored by GuidePoint. To learn more about GuidePoint Security, visit securityweekly.com/guidepoint. We've got one announcement real quick. InfoSec World 2023 is heading back to Orlando, Florida. Join the InfoSec community at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort, September 23rd to 28th. Experience world-class learning and networking through enlightening keynotes, informative panel discussions, interactive breakout sessions, hands-on workshops and summits, and more. As a Security Weekly community member, you're able to receive 20% off your InfoSec World 2023 tickets using code ISW23-SecWeek20. Register today at securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld2023. Kristen is Director of Application Security Engineering at GuidePoint Security. Prior to that, Kristen consulted for numerous companies performing application security services. She has a background in the government sector, bringing application security programs and guidance in secure application design. Kristen's experience includes conducting application security assessments and database security reviews, secure SDLC consulting, as well as working with clients to improve their enterprise vulnerability management. Everybody needs that. Kristen is a strong champion for security with her ability to bridge the gap between technical and non-technical people, coupled with her strong interpersonal skills. Hello, Kristen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate being here.
Well, we're going to need all those interpersonal skills as well as some of those application security skills to talk about, securing APIs, and I think an angle here to talk about the consequences of decisions that Appsec teams make and developers make, especially in choosing tools, in deciding that, this is what must be done before an API can go live, or what a secure API looks like, because there's a lot of ways that can go wrong. There's a lot of ways that we can not collaborate effectively. So I'm curious, with a little bit of that setup, I think you've been working on some research. A lot of this has been to your attention. What are some of those hurdles, challenges, mistakes, and other synonyms that you've often seen Appsec and development teams run into here?
Well, sure. So, I think it's a complex problem, right? So we have to kind of approach it from a variety of angles. I think one of the things that's important to mention is that APIs and building APIs and using APIs is not new to development. They've been around for a very long time. Most of the time, they were kind of more on the back end and sort of not as public facing. And I think people wanted the ability to reuse code and to interconnect systems, right? And to use master data instead of copying instances of data all over the place, which is all great. But that also has brought APIs, I think, to the forefront. The way we assess them really hasn't changed. It's just how much of them do we control, right? So we have to think about, are we writing secure APIs? So we have to think about it coming from that perspective. But most organizations have data flowing through a lot of third-party APIs. So then the secondary question is, how do we support that? How do we support at our gateway level and secure those things as well, the things that are sort of farther outside our control? And that's kind of where your question is going, right? when we start looking at all these new technologies on the market, they're all kind of trying to solve different problems and come at it from different angles. There's the discovery piece of most people don't know what they have, so let's go find it, right? And then there's the how do we test or protect our data going through third-party APIs, and then how do we make sure that we're writing secure APIs? So where we're deploying these technologies and how we're deploying them impacts more than just the development teams and security teams. It might impact the cloud teams or the server teams, infrastructure teams, those kinds of folks. That was a lot.
Yeah, and part of what you mentioned there too is that, we're still securing APIs the same way we have been from the beginning. And there is, there was the OWASP top 10 that started off. And there is actually an OWASP top 10 for API security that's branched off. And as a little bit of background, we tend to maybe not give a skeptical eye, but maybe we don't go deep into the OWASP top 10 lists. So I'm curious, what if we, turning that comment into perhaps a value judgment, is it still good that we're just still securing APIs like we have been for the last 20 years? Is there something that we're missing that we should be doing better tool-wise, process-wise, something like that?
So I love the OWASP API top 10 from the standpoint that it does cover the bases, not just in the API security vulnerability, what's the word I'm looking for? Categories. But it also addresses design and architecture. So that's very good. And then OWASP also has some enhancements as far as how to go a step further. But to your point, yeah, we definitely, that's not going to solve all of the issues, especially because of those third-party APIs. And, we're also seeing these new attacks like the Move It attack, where people have been, these supply chains attacks where, that vendor that's using Move It maybe three spots down or three endpoints down from where we really have control over our data and where our data is flowing. So that's added complexity as well. And how do we approach those problems, those supply chain problems, right?
Well, part of that supply chain problem, I think, starts off with, as you said at the beginning, like discovery, just what do you have? And obviously, I think that's a classic problem. So it's not too insightful for me to point that out. But is that maybe playing around on the tools side of the equation here? Are people jumping in the wrong way with tools or with pen testing to say, oh, we've got to start looking for the cross-site scripting, the SQL injection, and they're skipping some better strategic approach to an API security program? I think maybe that's what I'm trying to get at here.
100%. I mean, we have to at a high level document and start doing things like threat modeling, start looking for data flows, start looking at, where those trust boundaries are and come at it from a programmatic approach. We have to enable developers to understand what are the issues that we're trying to prevent and, what are some of the low hanging fruit. Like we've always known that APIs were a treasure trove for detailed error messages, mostly because APIs are GUI-less, right? So developers sort of left verbose error messages out there, not thinking about how easy it is to proxy that traffic. And, and they also were trying to solve their own problem of, well, a user has an issue with an API, at least we can look at the error message and sort of drill down from there. But it still presents the same problem we've always faced with those things, rendering in the browser as well, where we're giving information to an attacker. So yeah, 100%, we need to come at it from all the different perspectives. Like you say, discovery, getting a handle on what we know is out there, but we don't really know what it is or how many of them there are. But we also, developers it's so important for developers to document. And yet that's always one of the biggest issues with development, right? Is developers don't want to document. So do we have good API documentation? And if not, we absolutely need to create it across the board somehow so that we can test, it's hard to test APIs without the proper documentation around them too.
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit because there's an aspect of like security awareness, security education that we've also been telling developers, you should care about security, which I think they do. But it also, for just telling people, write secure code for the last 20 years, maybe we haven't been doing security awareness right. And if talking about like documenting APIs, I think developers may push back. Why should we be documenting our API for the Appsec team just to know that we checked a bunch of boxes? So my question more is, what does a good API documentation look like? What is that is like respecting the time of the developers, that's making it useful, consumable, and informative, either for other developers or even just from that security standpoint?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we have always wanted, especially if we're doing like a manual pen test of an API, is well-formed HTTP request and response pairings, or some level of documentation, whether it be Swagger, SOAP UI. We need to understand, what does a well-formed response look like? Because if you've worked in the API world, you've seen some weird, well-formed responses, right? So we want to start out with, what does good look like? And then we can start playing and manipulating with, now we're going to start seeing if we can do bad things. So that's extremely important. And I'll kind of liken it to this. When we are testing from that white hat or gray hat perspective, whether we're using tools and automating or whether we're doing a manual assessment, it's the same sort of thing where we've been asking developers for test credentials, right, for web applications for years and years and years. I don't need to test your MFA. I don't need to necessarily test your authentication. I can tell you, once you've given me test credentials, I can play around with that to tell you whether your authentication routines and functionality are secure. You don't want to waste anybody's time. Like, the difference between ethical hackers and non-ethical hackers is a deadline, right? So whether we're automating with tools, whether we're using people in manual testing, the more information that we have, the better test you get at the end, the better results you get, because we're not wasting time trying to guess at what a valid parameter looks like. We actually know what a valid parameter is. And so now we can actually start seeing, what can we do with that parameter to manipulate or to, inject something or whatever it be, right?
Yes, starting off with a more informed perspective of the application for the pen test is just more efficient, and honestly, it makes the pen tester's life easier, because they want to do the interesting things about how do these workflows particularly interact with each other. What are some edge cases, rather than just figuring out, how do I have to craft this HTTP request? So, in that, I think probably speaks to a degree of maturity within an Appsec program to be able to have those kinds of conversations, or to know that's what the conversation should start looking like. So, we mentioned OWASP, maybe the OWASP SAM. Are there ways, or what are the indicators for you that you're looking at either a ground zero in an Appsec program, or people are on their way to starting to do some smart things to begin to mature it?
So what we're looking for in an Appsec program is a combination of things. We want to see some governance. It doesn't have to be nth level degree. It has to be achievable. Initiatives that are in place, policies that are in place that people can actually, based on where they are in their learning curve, where they are in their maturity level, how much they're testing. We want achievable SLAs for developers to fix issues and those kinds of things. So we're looking at some structure. We're also looking at the ability for them to have some sort of tools to test, because it's hard to have an Appsec program if all you're doing is manual pen tests or third-party pen test every once in a while, right? You have to have something that you're able to test in an ongoing fashion. And then we're looking at, how much of the portfolio is being tested, right? What kinds of testing are we doing? How thorough is that? Are we just really looking at mission critical applications? And then based on those test results, is that organization actively fixing? And what does that look like? Are they leaving things out there forever? Are they only fixing the highs, but they have thousands or tens of thousands of mediums and lows? Those kinds of things are all going to come into play. And then how does the developer team and the security team communicate? And what does that look like, right? Because there has to be a pretty close relationship there to really, truly have a mature program.
Part of that too is I think there's an aspect, going back a little bit to the developer education security awareness. What does that look like within either, the low maturity, just getting started versus, what a desirable end case? So whether you've seen that in practice or not, I'm curious, what would you love to see as a security education program?
Sure. So I think education is the key to them. That's what a mature program looks like, right? We live in a world where most of the developers have not, unless they just have happened to be part of an organization with a mature Appsec program, they have not been exposed to these concepts, more than likely. There's not an easy way for, developers can't just go through their college curriculum and get this kind of information and education. So the more we are teaching and the more these developers know, the more mature an Appsec program can be. So education, first and foremost, it's huge. And we want to do that proactively. So I think from a program starting at zero, it's like, let's get out there and talk to people about this is basically what an Appsec program looks like. And then we can start saying, okay, here's OWASP top 10, and we can get more granular from there. And as we see siloed development groups and we start seeing test results from them, we'll start to see trending vulnerabilities. And then we can start laser focusing that training to those specifics of, hey, you guys are introducing a lot of cross-site scripting. So over in this group, we need to target you all to understand how to better not do that.
I think that's a common refrain we hear in the sense of here is something that's prevalent within the code that's relevant to the developers, and target those classes of vulns, like target cross-site scripting, because I think, you mentioned, I don't think it's uncommon necessary for large companies to have thousands of low and medium types of vulns, but I think I've come around to the idea that I kind of shrug and don't care about a lot of those thousands of low vulns. I think that's the way you would burn out a development team saying, our program is going to get to zero. So how much of that is my desire versus you've actually seen in practice? Have you seen companies actually take that type of risk tolerance?
So we have to some degree. And what I say to some of that is some of that low hanging fruit is stuff that we can course correct, right? Like, why are we returning platform information in an HTTP response? Like, why are we looking at thousands of those in our dashboards? Why not just teach developers to not do that? So I do have expectations of developers getting better at that. So we're just not increasing our technical debt, but I hear you. I do think that there's a flip side of that equation, though. There are some medium vulnerabilities that on their own are pretty innocuous, but when combined together, they make a perfect storm and can decimate the security posture of an application. So what we recommend is there needs to be some analysis, right? There needs to be some sort of human being that's going in there to really say, okay, do we care about these things? Can we table them? Or are there some of these things that we really should address because of the nature of how they could come together and produce a really, a high or a critical?
Yeah, I think
one of the interesting things about that, Kristen, I'm looking at it from with engineering manager hat on. One, I can go and educate my team to a team to, not put the server info into the info page. But is that worth the time of me actually teaching them? And I get both sides of that, but sort of on the second one, if I've got, as we're saying, 10,000 of these, say an info level or even a medium level issue, it's not that much of it's worth the time of investment as well as it's worth, there's not that many of them to do the triage on the, say, 500 or hopefully not 1,000 criticals. But how do you make that argument of just spending the time to triage through that list you just mentioned to figure out where do I actually want to say yes or no? I mean, that by itself takes time.
Yeah, so we're targeting things. So we know that there's a boatload of things that we can kind of ignore, right? And to your point, of the things that we sort of want to teach them to do better. So like platform returned an HTTP response is a perfect example of that. We're starting to see less version information. We're starting to see more and I don't care as much about, the fact that it's using an ASP.NET server, but if I can get all the version information and it's outdated, that's a whole nother set of issues, right? So there are some ways that we can go through and toss a lot of that to the side. As far as your question as an InfoSec manager, from that perspective, and is it worth the time to teach? I think it is. And what we're doing is using things like the Security Champions program as a vehicle. And by that, I mean not to train, but to work with developers side by side to define some core baseline secure coding requirements. So the way that we're doing that is we're saying, okay, Mr. Customer, we're going to mix in some coding requirements that will code against cross-site scripting, right? Your big ticket item. But we're also going to include some things that are like, if you have a sensitive cookie, these are the configuration, these are the key configuration objectives that you have to have. And these are the 4 requirements around a sensitive cookie, right? The first time that developer sees that requirement, there may be some learning curve where they're like, don't really know how to do that. Never done that before. They may have to figure it out. Second time they see that requirement, they're going to be like, I did this before. Let me just go back and check my notes. The third, the fourth time they look at that requirement, they're like, I got this. I know what I'm doing. And so through creating some, again, achievable requirements, over time, we can change the course of that organization's existence and the maturity of their Appsec program, because we can build upon that and we can put it places to where new developers get onboarded. And part of it is, here are your secure coding requirement, application security perspective requirements. Do you understand this? And if so, sign off on it and we'll review it again in a year. Just like their HR onboarding or anything else, acceptable use policies and those kinds of things. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I like that aspect of starting it as a more prescriptive secure coding. Here's what to do, because that always feels more actionable. Developers can understand this is the design pattern we want to follow. These are design decisions we want to make, rather than don't write insecure code, which is a bit open-ended, unbounded problem, if you will. Part of that, though, there's still an aspect of that triage that is, that can be time consuming. And I hear that, and personally, I'm like, I'm definitely not going to raise my hand. I'm going to have to be voluntold to do that work, because it doesn't scale. It's not fun. And honestly, a little bit of joking aside, it's also a great way to burn someone out to just looking at yet another medium. Are there shortcuts? Are there kind of some heuristics that you have for making, effective triage, or trying to avoid that burnout in doing that sort of triage?
Sure. So typically when we're talking at that kind of level where you've got thousands of things to look at, what we're pushing it down the road. We're not doing it immediately. If somebody has tens of thousands of lows, they've had hundreds and, probably maybe even thousands of criticals and highs to work through, right? So we're working through all of those. And that's also giving those developers a chance to learn. We can be educating them in the process, starting to build out some of those core requirements and starting to give them some of that. But we don't even talk to them about those mediums and lows till later. And by the time we start having those conversations, and we have a large organization doing that right now, right? They've had their SAST SCA and some training modules for a while. They've worked through a boatload of their critical and highs. They're to the point where now that new ones are coming in, the developers have worked through the backlogs so they get it. So that education factor is, again, that learning curve's a lot more flat than it was. And so now we're starting to pivot and say, okay, as part of our house cleaning, we've got this. We're good on the highs and criticals. Now we're going to start facing this boatload of other things. And they're not trying to bite off, they're not trying to eat the elephant all at once. They're trying to, take it in chunks, right? So, and it's working. And I think the developers now, from a from an organizational culture perspective, they're in a different place than they were when they started out this program. So the burnout factor's not as great, right? And we're going to target, like, what are the mediums around authentication, right? Do we have lack of account lockouts? Because those we want to shore up. Do we have weaker passwords? Those are all kinds of those are in medium land, but they're things that we want to definitely address before other things. So we start looking at, from that perspective, right? And then it's still meaningful.
Yeah, so let's bring medium land together with John's manager land, because he's trying to figure out how do I spend my time, my developer's time, or developer on these teams. And let's say we spent the time now, we spent the money, so the CFO comes knocking on John's door as well. How do we give some indicators that we're better, we are more secure, we're less risky? We can phrase that in a couple different ways, but I'm getting to the idea that InfoSec still struggles with metrics. What are some ways that you look at here?
And this is for me.
Yes. We could put John on the spot, but yeah.
Okay. No, I just want to make sure. So, 100%. So we want to look at, I like to get mature with metrics over time and do baby steps with that as well. So we want to show ROI through, this is how many issues we've closed to date. This is how many issues we're closing as false positives to see a decline in that, because hopefully we're setting certain things and getting them out of our way so we don't see them over and over and over again. How much of our portfolio, that percentage of code, of all the code that we have, are we actually testing? How long are vulnerabilities living from the time that they're validated until the time that they go down? And then, what is the rate of fixing new vulnerabilities coming in? All of those things paint a picture. You're right. From when you start getting flatter because you've fixed all those criticals and highs, the ROI, we have to show it in other ways, because at that point, are we really testing everything we've got? Or do we want to table the mediums and lows and make sure that we're not identifying more highs and criticals by continuing to test more of our code base? And the rate of reintroduction too. That's a big thing we want to do. Okay. And then as you mature in your organization, you want to start pushing some of this into the QA program. And, we talk about the whole requirements-driven testing domain that's now in OWASP SAM. Well, what that's really referring to in some senses, in some organizations, is pushing some of that testing into QA, into their automated approach for regression testing. So it's that other, we've always talked about treating vulnerabilities as bugs to get buy-in from developers. Well, now let's talk about treating the reintroduction of vulnerabilities as bugs too, and push that into the QA world where we're automating and doing regression testing to make sure that we're not reintroducing. So there's some ways that as organizations, they can further mature themselves with that ROI and those metrics as well.
Along that theme too, we've been talking about, for example, tools, and there are, for example, plenty of open source tools, freely available tools, but those can have overhead. It takes time to use, and so once again, it comes that idea of like from in manager land, somebody needs to curate them, maintain them. There's overhead, even though the price is free. Have you seen? Do you have some guidance there in the sense of mistakes to avoid in adopting open source, or ways to emphasize using some open source that's actually more helpful, more effective?
So in today's Appsec world, I truly feel like you get what you pay for, right? So, and I do think to that end that people have very sacred, their budget dollars are sacred, right? They're very finite, and they have to spend them and get the most bang for the buck as possible. So there is this notion that people are sacrificing some quality over price to be able to assure that they have a full set of tools. And I don't think there's a problem with that, because there is overlap across the different tools. I do think that you need to have some robust. I don't think you can do everything on open source tools. And I think you have to be careful. Open source tools are, supported by the community. They can go unmaintained. They can go sort of left out there. And we've seen that over time. It's a hard conversation to have. But if you really need and you really want true AppSec, I don't suggest open source tools. If you have strict regulatory compliance or, don't want to end up on the face of the paper, or if you have a very immature development organization from a security skill set perspective, I highly recommend spending that investment to get things, A, tested robustly, and B, getting those developers educated. It's super important.
Going to come back on that's interesting. And so I'll say surprising to me a bit about, the open source, because they have, there are different types of organizations out there too, different types of budgets and maturity. So speaking of difference as well, there's also the idea of like throwing over to QA. I haven't seen, it's been probably 10 or 15 years since I personally worked in an org that had actually a dedicated QA type to it. Now, a lot of developers are QAing their own code. I'm curious, you mentioned too, there's the automated regression tests. Do you see QA often as kind of a distinct counterpart? Or is that really just more of the responsibility that is still that DevOps team, Agile team, what have you?
Most of what I'm seeing is that there are QA teams, and most of them in the organizations that I've talked to and worked with in the last, let's say, 2 years, have had a lot of QA teams that are really more manually still testing, trying to move to more automation. Because these are, in many cases, larger organizations with larger development teams. So they're either partially into and have a hybrid model where they're still doing some regression testing manually and then have some automation that they're building out, or they're still in that manual phase driving towards the automation. But yeah, we're still seeing a lot of QA teams. So that's interesting because that you're seeing something different.
Yeah, and the industry is big, so that's there. Lots of developers love to, and organizations, I should say, love to organize in many different ways, and maybe there's an element of maturity there, also industry slices. So we'll have to look at. I don't know who's developing the latest, state of security or state of X reports, but they tend to slice up industry and metrics like that. We'll have to check that out. One of the other things that we do like to talk about and ask our guests is describing AppSec in 3 words. And one of the reasons I like to do this, and maybe we will switching this to the beginning of the interview, is just getting a sense of how do people see AppSec, and what does, and I'm not trying to build this up too much or pin it down to this is the only way to see AppSec in 3 words, but it's often illuminating because we've gotten a lot of creative and very different types of responses. So with that long preamble that hopefully gave you a little bit of time just to make sure you thought through your response, give you a little prep there, what would be your AppSec in 3 words?
I would say it's complex. It's extremely diverse. Kind of have to know a lot of things across the spectrum to manage it. And it's ever changing. It's very fluid. Maybe fluid's a better word because ever changing technically, I guess, is too with a hyphen. But
we could throw a hyphen in there.
It keeps you on your toes. I've been doing it for over 18 years and there's never a dull moment.
No, and I think, and what's interesting is that, I love that idea. I love that response. And it's funny to hear the complexity and the fluidity or the ever changing, but we're still stuck on, like you had mentioned, cross-site scripting. I'd mentioned SQL injection. There still seems a lot of things that are ever not changing to create a single 2 hyphenated word.
That's 100% true, right? And part of the reason why that is because organizations that have been around for as long as some of these applications have been around, they're supporting, classic ASP.NET. They're supporting legacy applications, but they're also supporting cloud native applications, right? And everything in between. So we have to have an Appsec program that works for all of those people, all of those different methodologies, and all of those different technologies. And I think that's why we still have to have that working knowledge of what we knew to, and we're talking about 20 years ago, as well as all the things that we're talking about now with all the supply chain attacks and the third-party component attack, all of those different things that we never had to even think about because they weren't even something that was in our world or in our, I don't know,
on our top 10 lists. Yeah, exactly. But no, I think we did a news segment before this, and one of the articles that I actually didn't mention was Cold Fusion. So there's a new Cold Fusion critical vuln, and I like ASP.NET. Cold Fusion is another name that I've not heard in a long time. To sort of quote Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yes, exactly. But rather than looking 20 years back, Kristen, help us look maybe a bit longer than 20 minutes ahead, but maybe 20 months ahead. What's coming up that you'd like to draw listeners' attention to?
Well, I think the open source discussion, right? I still run across folks who are unfamiliar with software composition analysis. Now we're even getting beyond software composition analysis and talking about, well, what about all of the own tools, not the open source tools, but some of the other, tools that people are using in libraries and dependencies that are being, widespread. Because I think it's a great attack surface for attackers. Rather than me go after your application and your users, now all I need to find is some flaw in something that everybody uses across the globe that hasn't been maintained or touched in 2 years. And there was a report that came out not long ago that said, literally, it was something like 40% of all of the open source components that are widely used have not been touched by any developer in over 2 years. So they're all over the place out there. And we're just continuing to see them to emerge. And we're seeing organizations, Log4j gave us a perfect example where organizations weren't identifying that issue at its root cause as an AppSec issue, and they still haven't found instances of it in their environments, so they're still getting popped. I mean, I confirmed that with our DFIR team, and they said, yeah, we're seeing it all the time. So that's going to continue to be hugely problematic and a hard problem to solve.
Yeah, I think that goes down to the idea of just discovery. What's on your network, open source or otherwise? And it's good to see that organizations like openssf.org have been putting that money into looking at what are the top 500 apps out there, top 500 use packages, and securing them, putting some money and budget behind that work. We've also put a lot of, not money, I suppose. We've put a lot of time into this conversation, Kristen, and we're running out. Our budget has come to the end. But I do want to say thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry I stuttered a few times in there, but it's been wonderful.
I think it'll all be seamless when it goes out to the recording. Thank you again for your patience. Thanks again to John. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of things that are fabulous, like Barbie, check out Stardust by Parallels. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.